Lillian Carter was not the kind of woman people noticed twice. At 62, her frame was thin and angular, her silver hair always tied back in a tight bun. Locals in the small town of Pine Hollow called her the Quiet One, a name whispered not unkindly, but with the sort of pity reserved for people who had endured too much. She lived alone in a small wooden cabin nestled at the edge of the forest, where the trees grew wild and dense. Her days passed in quiet routines, tending her herb garden, collecting rainwater, knitting scarves she never sold, and walking the forest trails with the cautious steps of someone who knew the woods better than she knew most people. She hadn't spoken to her estranged sister in over a decade. Her husband had died long ago, and her only child had vanished into the big city and never looked back. But Lillian didn't complain. She found peace in the stillness, in the chirping of birds, in the soft hum of the kettle as she brewed her favorite chamomile tea. That morning, like many others, Lillian had ventured into the woods to collect medicinal leaves. The early mist still hung low, clinging to her boots and the hem of her coat. Birds chattered above her as she moved through the underbrush, careful not to damage the roots of the elderberries she had planted years ago. She hummed to herself, a lullaby from her childhood, when something stopped her mid-step. Sound. Faint. Unnatural. She froze, listening. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the rustle of leaves or the creak of branches. It was human. A groan. Heart fluttering, Lillian followed the sound deeper into the forest. The trees grew closer here, their bark damp, the sunlight struggling to pierce through the canopy. And then, just past a crooked maple, she saw him. Man. Collapsed near the base of the tree. His body curled slightly, one leg awkwardly bent. Blood stained his shirt, a deep, angry red that had spread across his ribs. His face was bruised, dirt smudged into his jaw, and his hands were scraped raw, as if he had clawed his way through something, or away from someone. Lillian's first instinct was to step back. This wasn't her problem. She could go back, call someone, alert the sheriff. But as she stared at him, at the rise and fall of his chest, shallow and slow, something in her heart wouldn't let her leave. She knelt beside him, her knees sinking into damp moss. "Sir," she whispered. "Can you hear me?" No answer. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched his wrist. Pulse. Faint but there. Still alive. "Lord help me," she muttered. "I don't know what I'm doing." With surprising strength for someone often described as frail, Lillian slid her arms under his and began the slow, excruciating process of dragging him back to her cabin. It wasn't far, but through uneven terrain and muddy trails, every inch felt like a mile. Her back screamed. Her fingers cramped. But she didn't stop. By the time they reached her doorstep, she was soaked in sweat, her breath ragged. She eased him onto the wooden floor, fetched a pillow, and lifted his head gently. The next hours were a blur. She cut away the blood-soaked fabric, cleaned his wounds with warm water and antiseptic from her old nursing kit, a remnant from a life before all the loneliness. She stitched what she could, wrapped what she couldn't, and whispered apologies each time he groaned in pain, though he never fully woke. That night, Lillian sat beside him, wrapped in her shawl, watching the stranger sleep restlessly on her couch. The storm outside had begun, rain tapping gently against the windows. She sipped her tea in silence, her thoughts spinning. Who was he? His clothes were unusual, not ragged like a vagrant's, but not from any store she recognized. His boots were military grade. His shirt had a torn patch, half-ripped, with faint lettering she couldn't make out. Why was he out there? And why did she feel the creeping sense that helping him wasn't just an act of kindness, but a choice that might change everything? Lillian wasn't naive. She had seen enough of the world's darkness to know danger didn't always knock. Sometimes it bled quietly on your floor. She looked at him again, at the unconscious man whose life now rested, however briefly, in her hands. And in the flicker of candlelight, she whispered to the empty room, "Who are you, and what did you run from?" She didn't know then that the answer would shake the foundation of her quiet life. But the forest had whispered, and she had listened. For 3 days the stranger didn't speak. He drifted in and out of fevered sleep, muttering words that made no sense. His forehead burned with heat, his shirt clung to his chest with sweat, and Lillian changed his bandages with hands steady from years of solitude, but not without fear. She wasn't afraid of blood. No, she had seen enough of it in her younger days working part-time as a nurse's aide in town. What frightened her now was what she didn't know. His name, his past, what kind of trouble he might bring to her quiet cabin at the edge of the forest. Each morning, she'd sit in the old rocking chair beside the couch, a cup of tea in hand, listening to the wind rustling through the trees outside. She watched him sleep, as if hoping his expression might offer answers. And still silence. By the fourth morning, she found him sitting up. The sound of wood creaking under his weight startled her. She had been outside gathering mint leaves when she returned to find him groggily upright, his hand pressed to his side, his eyes darting across the room like a cornered animal. Their eyes met. He stared at her with an intensity that froze her in place. His jaw tightened and his voice, though hoarse, cut through the air like a blade. "Where am I?" Lillian stepped forward slowly, palms open. "You're safe," she said softly. "You're in my home. I found you in the woods. You were hurt. Badly." He blinked, disoriented. "You patched me up." She nodded. "Yes. I did what I could." He looked down at the bandages, then at the blanket draped over his legs. His hands clenched. "Did you call anyone?" Lillian hesitated. "No. Should I have?" His body tensed further, and he swung his legs off the couch, wincing from the pain. "No," he muttered. "No one. Ever." "Easy now," Lillian said, stepping closer. "You're not ready to stand." "Why would you help me?" he snapped, the sharpness in his voice more defensive than cruel. Lillian took a breath. "Because you were bleeding and unconscious in the forest. And because I couldn't just leave you there to die." He stared at her, truly looked at her for the first time. Frail, yes, but not weak. Her eyes were steady, her voice calm. Not frightened, just present. "What's your name?" she asked gently. He paused, his throat working as if the word were hard to form. "Daniel," felt rehearsed, like a name pulled from a list, rather than from memory. But Lillian nodded. "All right, Daniel. I'm Lillian. And whether that's your real name or not, I'll call you that. You need to rest. Your wounds aren't just going to vanish overnight." He leaned back against the couch, breathing heavily. "How long was I out?" 3 days. You had a fever for 2 of them. I thought I was going to lose you." Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. "Would have been easier if you had." The words stung, though they weren't meant to. Lillian didn't respond right away. She simply moved to the stove, poured a fresh cup of tea, and set it on the table beside him. "You're not dead," she said quietly. "That means something. Whether you think so or not." For a moment, the only sound in the room was the crackling of the fire in the corner. Daniel stared into it, eyes unfocused, as if seeing something far away. War. Betrayal. Loss. Lillian didn't know. But whatever it was, it clung to him like smoke. Over the next few days, they settled into a strange rhythm. He never told her much. Avoided eye contact. Didn't answer her questions. But he accepted her help. Stiffly at first, then with a reluctant kind of trust. She learned his pain patterns by heart, the way he gritted his teeth when standing, the slow shuffle to the bathroom, the deep sigh when she redressed his wound. He never asked for anything, but she gave him comfort where she could. Broth, warm water, silence when needed. Still, something about him didn't add up. Lillian had seen plenty of injured men before. Hunters, hikers, the occasional reckless teenager. But Daniel was different. The scars on his arms weren't from brambles or falls. They were older, deliberate. Some thin and white, others newer. He moved like someone trained, aware of every sound, every angle, like danger lived behind every shadow. And there was that patch on his torn shirt she hadn't forgotten. Faint letters barely visible under the rip. AP. She'd hidden the shirt in a drawer after cleaning the blood off it. He hadn't asked for it. One evening, as rain pattered gently on the roof and Daniel dozed on the couch, Lillian sat by the window, knitting in the dim light. She heard him stir. "I don't belong here," he said suddenly, his voice raw. She looked up. "What do you mean?" Daniel didn't look at her. "This piece. This place. I shouldn't have brought my mess to your doorstep." Lillian placed the knitting needles down. "You didn't bring anything. Found you. That was my choice." He looked at her then, and for a second, something cracked in his guarded expression. Gratitude, maybe. Or guilt. "I wasn't supposed to survive," he said. "But you did." He hesitated. "That might be a problem." Lillian's stomach sank. "Who's looking for you, Daniel?" He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned forward, gripping the edge of the couch. His face pale, his breath short. "I need to leave soon," he said. "They'll come." "Who will?" "I can't tell you." Lillian stood slowly. "You don't have to tell me everything. But I deserve to know if danger's coming to my home." He looked up at her, and for the first time, his eyes held something almost like shame. "I never meant to involve anyone," he said. "But if they find out I'm alive, you're not just some lost hiker, are you?" He didn't answer. Lillian nodded once, tight-lipped. "Then we'd better start preparing." Daniel blinked. "You're not going to throw me out." She met his gaze evenly. "You may be hiding from something. But I've hidden my whole life too. And I'm tired of it." The silence between them deepened, no longer heavy with fear, but with something unspoken. An understanding. A fragile alliance born not of truth, but of necessity. Outside, the wind picked up. Inside, for the first time, Daniel allowed himself to lean back. Not just into the couch, but into the idea that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone. The rain didn't stop for 2 days. It beat relentlessly against the roof of Lillian's cabin, drumming a rhythm that felt almost ominous. Inside, the fire crackled low, and the warmth of the small hearth was the only comfort between the two strangers trapped in a silence that had begun to thicken with unspoken truths. Daniel's strength was returning. He no longer needed help standing or walking, though he moved with a slight limp and held his ribs whenever he laughed, which was rare. But the physical healing did little to soften the tightness in his posture or the walls in his eyes. Lillian noticed he slept with one ear uncovered, always alert. When he sat, he positioned himself so he could see the front door and window. And he flinched, subtly but noticeably, whenever there was a knock from a branch on the glass. He never let her see him fully change the bandage on his side. Not anymore. Still, there were moments, small, fleeting, when his guard slipped. He once asked her if she believed people could start over. She replied that she wasn't sure, but she believed people could choose to stop running. Another night, he offered to chop firewood, and though she knew it pained him, he spent an hour outside splitting logs under the misting sky, returning soaked but strangely at peace. But Lillian couldn't ignore the gnawing question at the center of it all. Who was he really? She had waited for him to tell her. Waited for the truth to come out in pieces, like a dropped trail of breadcrumbs. But Daniel offered only fragments, enough to keep her close, but never enough to make her feel safe. And then one morning everything changed. It began with a knock at the door. Not the wind. Not a branch. A real knock. 3 slow raps. Lillian froze at the stove, her hands shaking. Daniel was already up, eyes narrowed, body tense. He mouthed, "Don't answer it." But it was too late. The knock came again, louder this time. Lillian stepped toward the door, but Daniel grabbed her wrist. "Stay back." She had never seen that look on his face before. Not fear. Calculation. Through the peephole, Lillian saw a man in a tan jacket, holding an umbrella. He had a badge clipped to his belt, but no visible firearm. Clean-shaven. Polite face. The kind of man who would never raise suspicion in a grocery store. He leaned closer to the door. "Sorry to bother you, ma'am," he called out. "I'm Agent Keller with the Office of Federal Protection. We're looking for someone who may have passed through this area recently." Lillian's breath caught. She glanced at Daniel, whose jaw had clenched tight. Agent. Federal protection. May I ask a few questions? The man added. Lillian's voice trembled, but she answered. I live alone. Haven't seen anyone but squirrels and birds in weeks. There was a pause. Then Keller said, Understood. Thank you for your time, ma'am. Be careful. It's not safe out there. She heard his footsteps retreat. Only after 10 long minutes did Daniel move away from the wall. They found me, he whispered. Lillian stared at him. Why are they after you? Daniel turned to her slowly. His expression weighed with exhaustion. Because I saw something I wasn't supposed to. Lillian sat down on the edge of the couch. Her voice was low but steady. Start talking. He ran a hand through his dark hair, then sank into the chair across from her. I worked for the government, he began. Not some shady back office, I mean real work. Department of Communications. Oversight Division. I reviewed intelligence reports, cross-referenced military briefings. I was the guy who signed off on files that were too sensitive for the press. Lillian frowned. That still doesn't explain the men at my door. One day, I saw something I wasn't supposed to. A report marked as internal error, buried deep in an old military archive. It wasn't an error. It was evidence. Proof of a black site operation running without congressional oversight. Civilians held without charges. Interrogations. Things we weren't supposed to be doing anymore. But we were. He took a breath, steadying his hands. I brought it to my supervisor. She told me to forget it. That it was above my clearance. Next thing I know, my access gets revoked, I'm being followed, and my phone goes dead. I left everything behind and ran. Lillian's lips parted. So you're a whistleblower. Daniel looked away. I didn't get far enough to blow anything. I barely escaped with my life. I was headed toward a contact, someone who could help me leak the files. But they caught up to me in the woods. I thought they'd killed me. You must have known hiding here would only be temporary, she said. I didn't plan on surviving at all. Silence fell again. But this time it was thick with understanding and fear. You shouldn't have helped me, he said after a long pause. You're in danger now. I was already in danger, she replied. Just a different kind. The kind that creeps into your life so slowly you don't notice until you wake up one morning and realize you haven't spoken to a soul in weeks. Daniel didn't answer. He simply stared at her, not with suspicion but with something closer to sorrow. Later that night, she opened the drawer where she had hidden his shirt. She examined the half-torn patch again. Not AP. API. American Protocol Initiative. She typed it into her old laptop. No results. No websites. Just an internal memo on a conspiracy forum about something called Project Gulliver. Top-level surveillance. No court orders. No warrants. Silent extraditions. Daniel wasn't just a man on the run. He was a man who knew too much, and the government wanted him erased. She closed the laptop and looked over at him sleeping on the couch. The man who had once flinched at the sound of her teakettle now lay there, half curled under the blanket she had knitted herself. His face, though tired, looked younger, vulnerable. She didn't know what she would do next. But she knew this. She wouldn't let them take him. Not without a fight. The next morning came gray and cold, the kind of morning that seemed to warn of something heavy approaching. Fog drifted low through the trees, and frost clung to the edges of the windows like trembling fingers. Inside the cabin, Lillian stood at the kitchen counter, staring at a half-empty kettle, her hands resting flat against the worn wood. She hadn't slept. Neither had Daniel. He'd sat awake most of the night near the fire, staring into the flickering flames, lost in a war she couldn't see. And now, without a word, he stood beside her, fully dressed, his boots tied, a bag slung over one shoulder. I'm leaving, he said. Lillian didn't look at him. They'll find you. I know. Then why walk into it? Daniel exhaled slowly. Because I've already brought enough danger to your door. I can't keep hiding here. They know I'm alive. They'll come back. You were kind to me. You don't deserve to pay for that. Lillian turned to face him. Her voice was calm but firm. And you think I'll just let them walk in here? Ask me questions. Tear apart my home. I'll send word when I'm safe, he added. I know someone who can still help. I can't drag you into this mess any further. But Lillian shook her head. You don't understand, she said. You already did. Daniel stopped, confused. She reached into the drawer near the stove and pulled out the torn shirt he had left behind. The API patch was visible now, cleaned and stitched around the edges, her way of preserving something that had become more than cloth, a symbol of the truth he carried. I looked it up, she said. I know what it means. Not the details maybe, but enough to know you're not a criminal. You're a witness. And if the wrong people get to you first, no one will ever know what they've done. Daniel's throat tightened. That's why I have to run. No, Lillian said. That's why we have to finish this. He blinked, unsure if he'd heard her right. We. She crossed her arms. You said you had a contact. Someone you were trying to reach. Do they still exist? Daniel nodded slowly. If they haven't gone dark, then you're not going alone. I'll take you as far as the road. My truck still works, and they won't expect it from someone like me. Daniel stared at her, really stared, and saw the truth. Beneath her delicate frame and quiet demeanor, there was a fire. It had been there all along, smoldering beneath the years of isolation and silence. A strength that didn't shout, endured. Why are you doing this? He asked, barely above a whisper. Lillian stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. Because for the first time in years I feel like I matter again. Not for what I've lost, but for what I can still protect. Daniel didn't answer. But he didn't argue either. They packed quickly. Lillian pulled a wool coat over her dress, tucked a pistol into the side of her old handbag, a relic from a time she never thought she'd touch again, and locked the front door behind them. The truck was rusty, but it roared to life on the second try. As they pulled onto the muddy forest road, Lillian's fingers tightened on the wheel. How far is the contact? Roughly 80 miles. A farmhouse just north of Harlington. There's a man named Shepherd. He used to be part of the oversight committee before he went public with a surveillance report. They buried him, stripped his credentials. But he's still alive. And trustworthy. He's the only one who didn't try to kill me. They drove in silence for nearly an hour, past pine trees soaked in mist, through sleepy towns where no one looked twice at an old truck. But 10 miles outside of Harlington, Lillian noticed the black SUV in the rearview mirror. She gripped the wheel. We've got company. Daniel turned. Same model as the one that pulled up to your cabin. They followed us. Floor it. But the truck couldn't outrun a modern SUV. It sputtered and groaned as Lillian pressed the gas, eyes locked on the road ahead. They're closing in. Daniel shouted. Turn right, into the orchard. Lillian swerved onto a dirt path, the truck jolting over uneven ground. Branches slapped the windshield, and mud sprayed across the hood. Behind them, the SUV skidded but kept pace. We're not going to make it, she cried. Daniel reached for the door. We don't have to. You do. What? Stop the truck. Lillian slammed the brakes, and before she could protest, Daniel jumped out and ran, drawing the SUV toward him like bait. No! She shouted, slamming the door and chasing after him on foot. She wasn't fast, but she was furious. As the agents jumped from the SUV and aimed their weapons at Daniel, Lillian stepped between them, holding her pistol out with both trembling hands. Drop your guns, she barked. The men hesitated, shocked to see an elderly woman in a shawl shouting commands. But her eyes didn't flinch, and her hands didn't shake. Drop them, she said again. The standoff seemed endless, until one of the agents, likely more nervous than loyal, lowered his weapon. That was all she needed. Daniel used the moment to lunge forward, disarm the second agent, and knock him to the ground. By the time the dust settled, one SUV was stalled in the ditch, and Daniel held both sets of keys. They didn't stop again until they reached Shepard's farmhouse. It was quiet, remote. Inside, Shepard, a weathered man with kind eyes, took one look at Daniel, then at Lillian and nodded solemnly. "You made it," he said. Daniel turned to Lillian, unsure what to say. She simply smiled. "You survived," she said. "Now make it count." He reached out and took her hand. And for the first time, he didn't look like a man on the run. He looked like a man ready to fight. Epilogue. A month later, a story broke on national news. A government whistleblower released classified documents proving the existence of the API black sites, igniting congressional hearings and mass public outrage. A full investigation followed. And in a quiet cabin at the edge of Pine Hollow, a woman sat with a cup of tea, her knitting needles in her lap, and the news playing softly in the background. No one ever knew her name. But Daniel never forgot. She had been the reason he lived. And in her quiet way, she had changed everything.